back of the rim. Got it! On the slam. Using Curry way downtown. Oh, what a shot from Curry!
The evolution of the NBA's Eastern Conference, a timeline. Made this video 5 years ago. One thing that hasn't changed is the Eastern Conference is still pretty much looked at as weak. Except that in 2019, it wasn't weak. That was actually one of the few years the Eastern Conference was respected. And funny enough, even if the teams haven't been respected, I mean, the branding has. It's just normally this branding belongs to teams who are lost in no man's land for years at a time. The question this video attempts to answer though is why? Why is it that you can pull from almost any year, any season, and the Western Conference is outpacing the East in terms of contenders and just overall team strength? Today we'll be looking at injuries, draft picks, trades, and anything else back to the 80s that can help us understand why the Eastern Conference has felt weak most of your life. Larry Bird joined the Boston Celtics in 1980, immediately catapulting them from the bottom of the East to a 60-win juggernaut, heading up a conference that wasn't exactly operating from a position of power to begin with. 61-win Boston Celtics, 59-win Dr. J-led Sixers, 50-win pre-Wilkins Hawks. Next closest team was 41 victories, and it only dropped off from there, which brings us to our first issue at the very beginning. Out east, there truly weren't many recognizable faces to go around who actually had great supporting casts. Bird had just joined the mix, Dr. J has already been discussed, and then it gets shaky. John Drew, Moses Malone, George Gervin, aging Elvin Hayes, Bill Cartwright was the leading scorer of the Knicks. Long story short, the list of names thins out at an extreme pace, and even if the name was legendary, their team was mid. Here's where I want to explain how this is in no way implying the East just started bad and was always bad. Rather, I'm mostly highlighting how the weak starting point from this era played its role in the eventual narrative. It didn't necessarily help matters when in 1980's draft, Red Auerbach pulled off an incredible finesse by sending a pair of first-round picks used to select Joe Barry Carroll and center Ricky Brown to Golden State for Robert Parrish and the draft pick used to select Kevin McHale. Damn. Your eyes do not deceive you. With very little effort, Red created possibly the greatest front court ever in just a few drafts, instantly providing Boston with a fairly solid death grip over the conference. Other great teams still popped up, but until the very end of the 80s, the only franchise to score a title outside of Boston was Philly, who were able to reach the mountaintop at long last. Lucky saw 5 finals trips, resulting in 3 titles and continuation of sports' greatest rivalry. There's a lot more under the surface. For instance, while Boston was dominating, drafts were distributing power across conferences randomly, yet as you'll see for this decade, maybe even evenly, I would say. From 1979 to 1989, here are numerous notable names picked and where they landed. What sticks out? For one, making this list, I was not intentionally trying to balance it. I organically ended up with only one more name in West's column. When I filter for players who were good enough that I'd fully expect anybody to recognize their names, you end up with similar results. All this to say, the East was not ass in the 80s despite the heavy dose of Boston's success. As a matter of fact, there's arguments to be made it was actually better than the West over this time period. Take into account teams such as Milwaukee, who I know you've never heard a single thing about, when as a franchise, the 80s were probably their strongest decade up until now. They're simply one of those units who couldn't break through, so they've been pruned from history. Moses Malone ended up joining Dr. J, Chicago gave rise to a future dynasty as the era wrapped up, then the bad boy Pistons broke through. Yeah, after the conference repeatedly only sent either Boston or Philly to represent it, this nasty, eventual game-changing squad was able to overcome and repeat, connecting the league to its Jordan era. Here were the standings during Chicago's first title of many. Are you curious what the men in green are still doing here in 1991? Suffering. With the second overall pick in 1986, the NBA champion Boston Celtics selected Len Bias, an imposing forward poised to keep a dynasty floating steady through the 90s. If you're asking why a champ had pick number 2, well yeah, Red had also finessed it a couple of years prior in a trade involving Gerald Henderson. Of course, you know a franchise who'd been dominating half a decade to this point being able to add such a force was too good to be true. On June 19th, 1986, Bias sadly overdosed while partying, creating one of the biggest, most tragic what-ifs ever, specifically to the East, because Boston now had no choice but to face Father Time faithfully. Sure, they'd also lucked into Reggie Lewis a year later, who almost immediately became a contributing piece, only he too tragically passed in 1993 from a heart condition after making his first All-Star team. Unreal, right? Over 7 years, an aging juggernaut had properly drafted, only to have its future totally altered by 2 outrageously rare events, back to back. Well, now you know partly why it took him so long to recover. Detroit was broken in spirit after finally being lapped by Jordan, also only a few years away from their cornerstone retiring after an Achilles injury. Milwaukee was tired and battered from years of falling short, getting ready to nosedive into their lost era, and every other team was gearing up to build their approaches to the next phase. Results? Well, as we all know, Jordan's Wolves went on to grab 6 of the available 10 titles, which could have hypothetically been even more without his retirement. Funny enough, I feel certain you've heard the generic criticism, which sounds something like, oh, Jordan couldn't break through until Boston and Detroit aged out. Just a roundabout way of saying his competition in the East was weak, if you will. Was it actually? Cleveland had built a solid team with Mark Price and Brad Daugherty. Patrick Ewing helped develop New York into yearly contenders. New Jersey found an absolute gem in Drazen Petrovic. Reggie Miller would eventually make Indy formidable, while teams such as Orlando and Miami would grow up later in the decade. 1992 bringing in the most dominant force basketball would ever see, Drazen Petrovic. On June 7th, 1993, the blossoming sharpshooter tragically passed in a horrific car accident at age 28. This counts as the 3rd Eastern Conference player to die in a 7-year span, although it's anybody's guess how much of an impact he'd have as he was such a late bloomer. Regardless, Boston's woes absolutely altered the power structure of the 90s East, as when Len Bias discourse was a thing, he'd been the guy partly expected to challenge Michael Jordan going forward. I pointed out once years ago how Mike's story is such a contrast to other top-tier legends. Where there was a Bird, Magic wasn't too far away. Where there was Bron, hell, he's played so long he stood face-to-face with Kobe and Steph. Jordan? He only faced the same finals opponents one time. As far as his East path goes, once he'd conquered Isaiah, it sure felt like a whole lot of randomness each year that vaguely included familiar foes sometimes. But there wasn't a one-to-one for him in terms of players, an equal. They tried putting Drexler in this position and, well, yeah. Point being, you can see the template for the East you probably grew up with right here. I wouldn't call it weak in MJ's time. I can also acknowledge Bias was probably supposed to be his rival. While Chicago continued to dominate, set records, ascend and hog the Eastern throne, plenty of other generational talents simply wilted and withered, unable to break through and claim a piece of the era for their own. By the time it was over, only New York and Orlando had achieved a finals berth after 1991, with everyone else left little time to rebound when Jordan finally called it quits in 98. Yeah, here were the ages of 90 stars you're familiar with by the 99 season, which was a miserable lockout by the way. The first chance people had to win without Chicago in the picture was a season starting in February. All this to say, the East wasn't bad at all during Jordan's run. There simply wasn't an equal to Chicago. And other team structure by the time they were done is partly what made it bad, as you maybe started paying attention. Take a look. A callback to the Little Orlando Magic mentioned earlier. They'd been one of 4 franchises to join the East between 1998 and 95. If you're familiar with the process, this creates more spots in the league, possibly diluting talent, and also opens up for expansion drafts, which essentially causes organizations to choose who will be left available to be drafted by new teams. Is the term watered down starting to bounce around in your brain? It was for players at the time. On January 5th, 1995, Richard Evans posted an article to Desert News saying, quote, "There are no great NBA teams this season. The prime evidence is Chicago. The Bulls are on their way to a 70+ win season, causing some people to call them a great team." Dennis Rodman didn't think they were that great, adding, quote, "This league is so filtered and watered down. We can beat anybody with our eyes closed, pretty much. Oof." Quote, "You look at the overall picture. It is diluted to some extent," said Coach Jerry Sloan. "You can get by with 3 great players on a team and have a chance to win it all. Before, you'd have to have 4 or 5 great players and some good players around them." Larry Bird and Charles Barkley echoed similar sentiments, and I think you get the point by now. Of Chicago's record-setting 72 wins, I counted 9 against expansion teams, and those were just the ones new to the East. Okay, which of these expansion franchises figured anything out in a timely manner? Back to Orlando, Shaquille O'Neal graced Disneyland with promises of success basically implied, delivering very shortly after his selection, going on to author a finals berth in 95. After a gut-wrenching sweep, he was gone a year later. What? Magic management began a long line of fumbling. While he'd very obviously already had eyes laid on LA to some extent, yes, a force to the likes I'm convinced we'll never see again, decided to bless the West, somewhat dooming the East in the near future. Take for instance the 1999 standings, which are most telling of how badly things had deteriorated. Records aside, because again, I'm starting to have the opinion this season should have just been fully cancelled, behind Mourning and Hardaway's Heat, there's leftovers of Shaq's Magic, Indiana trying to salvage an aging Reggie Miller, post Dominique Wilkins Hawks, Detroit attempting to rebuild around Grant Hill, Philly with their new answer, Milwaukee introducing Ray Allen, a rapidly aging Knicks team hoping to steal one with Jordan finally gone, and then roughly 7 rebuilding or younger teams. In other words, Chicago left this conference a lot worse off than they found it, with past their prime stars and new draftees who were years away from having contending teams. They might have been at a 20-year low point, however, the younger names at least provided opportunity for a healthy conference going forward. Here's what happened to each of them to prevent it. Actually, before we explore the new crop, we start with the first 2000s Eastern team to make the finals in 34-year-old Reggie Miller's Pacers. Yep. After spending a whole decade being unable to beat the teams who couldn't beat Chicago, they got their first crack at a title after virtually every other contender aged out. At a record of 56-26, they sat atop the East along with Miami's core, who were just about cooked, and same goes for New York. Every other unit was either building around a younger talent or were even lower on the totem. Naturally, this was at a time where Shaq and Kobe were tearing through the league, meaning any Eastern challenger was shit out of luck, especially with the current state of the rosters. Take Philly for example. They spent the 90s in a wasteland, awaiting their next savior after having lived through the Dr. J. Malone era, followed by a decent stretch from Charles Barkley. Enter Allen Iverson, who took a relatively short time to elevate his squad to, contention. The only problem is, once you peruse the roster, you immediately start scratching your head about how they ever got to share a final stage with Los Angeles. Theo Ratliff came in as the second leading scorer during 2001. Mutombo was 34 years old and his best days had definitely come and gone, yet he still won Defensive Player of the Year. Aaron McKie grabbed Sixth Man of the Year, then yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with what comes next. Mid. I remember watching a doc where head coach Larry Brown claimed if McKie hadn't gotten hurt, they'd have probably beat the Lakers. Okay, I want to tell you Aaron McKie was good, and how his absence still absolutely did not take Philly from 4 wins down to 1, which is where we truly begin to discuss the bleak future of the East. A team with Allen Iverson, 2 bigs, and almost no spacing whatsoever should not have been a finals team. I don't care what era it is. The bigger issue for Philly specifically, 2001 was literally as good as it get for as long as we know. To this day, the city of brotherly love has not surpassed 56 wins, nor have they so much as made a conference finals. Part of this has to do with how they spent the 2000s. Basically, they didn't get anything else out of the Iverson era, then took a long time to rebuild anything close to a contender. You're probably also familiar with the draft misses. Larry Brown promised Larry Hughes in '98 he'd pick him if he was available at the 8th spot, which he was. He gave him his word as a Larry, so in the end a promise kept Philly from getting the truth. In this same draft, Dirk was selected at 9, however I wouldn't spend too much time sad here as I don't know if I believe he ever becomes Dirk trying to develop in Philly. Finally, I remember hearing Iverson nearly had the honor of sharing a backcourt with T-Mac. I did not hear this deal fell apart because of Stephen A. Smith. I mean, surely take it with a grain of salt, but Toronto was reportedly ready to send McGrady and a first-round pick to Philly for, once again, Larry Hughes. I never knew Stephen A. breaking the deal allegedly caused Toronto to back out, so essentially all before AI even got to the only finals appearance of his career, he'd missed out on 3 different potentially career-altering duo partners, directly affecting how mid they were for his whole career there. On that front, the best player he got to run with was Andre Iguodala. Unfortunately, the goal was to eventually win a championship, not save Earth from a death beam. Your next Eastern Conference representative for 2 straight years? New Jersey, featuring Jason Kidd and yeah, okay, look. My goal is not to turn you against every single team who doesn't have a ton of stars or names you might not recognize from 2 decades ago. I am, however, wanting you by the end of the 2000 section to understand what the East had to work with early on. Jason Kidd, Keith Van Horn, Kerry Kittles, Kenyon Martin, and Richard Jefferson is actually really solid. It's just, what takes a team like them from solid to title winners is having a name like Jason Kidd next to Jason Kidd. Pretty much like how he tried to go join Tim Duncan a couple years later. You understood what I'm saying. New Jersey held the East's best record in 2002 at 52 wins. Following them were Detroit without Sheed, a thin Celtics lineup headed by a fairly dynamic duo, Orlando who lucked into T-Mac. Yeah, let's stop right there for a sec. Orlando nabs the 4th seed with 44 wins in McGrady's second campaign there, as he leads a roster featuring a Grant Hill who only managed 14 games, and a lot of players you've never cared about. Minus Mike Miller, who McGrady really liked by the way. Whoops, management shipped them out of Disneyland the very next year for rookies Drew Gooden and Gordon Gierachek. Problem: T-Mac loved Mike Miller. It'd been well known the two were inseparable for the couple years they got. Hell, I even found an old article from the Orlando Sentinel claiming bringing in Miller could land Mac a title. Worsening matters, he said during a radio call in 02 how he'd retire if Orlando ever traded his guy. Of course it was only hyperbole, but then they did do it, angering their franchise player while undoubtedly setting in motion the events leading to his departure. Speaking of departure, Tracy was only wearing an Orlando uniform because he left his high-flying cousin hanging in Toronto, instead of possibly building one of the most electric wing tandems we'd ever see. I wouldn't guarantee a title over it, however, I would say it'd have gone a long way in making the East a much more interesting place. This also applies to how Tim Duncan was supposed to depart San Antonio and join he and Grant Hill, and what would have formed the first type of big three we all eventually grew up with. This also applies to Grant Hill, who departed Detroit for Orlando as a high-flying, versatile forward who'd made 5 All-Star teams in 6 seasons, ranking in the MVP race every year since '96. Between Toronto and Orlando, there was some amazing intentions to seize power in an ever-weakening conference. In our timeline, T-Mac and Vince whisked away their primes on average to below-average teams by themselves, unable to acquire a contending-worthy running mate. Meanwhile, Duncan stayed out west, just adding to the wicked level of talent and dominance there. Speaking of, just so I don't leave the West totally out of most of this video, by 2002 you can already clearly see why one conference was smoking the other. Sacramento had an amazing team trying to break through. Spurs, Kobe and Shaq, Nash and Dirk, KG, with a lot of other teams who were barely making the playoffs that would have been top 4 out east. Back to New Jersey. With pretty much every other team doing some lone wolf act or simply lacking real resources, they got to represent us twice, dying both times to both West dynasties. If that doesn't paint the picture here, I'm not sure what else will. To even get to the 02 finals, their last opponent was a Boston team who was fresh off of fumbling Tony Parker in the previous draft. Personally, Parker, Pierce, and Antoine Walker sounds like a formidable trio in the early 2000s. As you know if you've seen my Celtics doc, because the owner didn't trust European point guards, a roster who got within 2 wins of a conference title was basically just 2 wing scorers and, like Philly, a whole lot of mid. For New Jersey's run in 03, they'd sweep Detroit, who'd rebuilt strong enough to, as we came to know, be 1 piece away from title contention. Still, it makes for a pretty nasty conversation. The Pistons, despite the sweep, were the first seed, making up the only East unit in 2003 to win 50 games. The West had 6 for reference. The usual cast made appearances, with Indy rejoining the ranks housing a now, checks notes, 37-year-old Reggie Miller. This isn't to downplay what Indy put together. With the 2000s finals team dying, faces such as Jermaine O'Neal, Ron Artest, and eventually Steven Jackson would provide hope they could squeeze one out for the greatest shooter of all time, at the time. Honestly, people still shit on the 03 Spurs supporting cast so much, you'd think some East team had a chance. I'd say pretty confidently none of them were dealing with 03 Timmy. We're approaching the mid-2000s part of our journey where things get interesting because we'd been blessed with an all-time draft. LeBron East, Wade East, Bosh East, Melo West. Take note here. It almost fully explains how the conference actually became tolerable towards the late 2000s. This influx of talent was so clutch it almost seemed scripted. Multiple franchises who were kinda floating around in no man's land or had no real idea how to proceed in a timely manner were granted some of the most consequential players in NBA history. Notice I've made no real mention of Cleveland? Well, that's because they spent most of the 90s being obscure first round outs before officially falling off in 99, scraping the bottom of the barrel until a hometown hero arrived. Does the franchise I just described sound like they were prepared to house and nurture what was considered the quote chosen one out of high school? More on this disaster later. Wade fell to Miami at a time where not only had they been unable to break through, their duo, which had been masterminded by Pat Riley, was literally robbed of any remaining time when Alonzo Mourning got sick. Had they not received Flash's blessing? Your guess about where it was going is as good as mine. Bosh would be the relatively late bloomer of the group, proving unable to reach superstar status until the whole Vince trade saga took place, which, if I may add, did kind of get Jason Kidd the name I was talking about, just too little too late. And finally, Melo. Funny enough, the eventual 04 champs came within a hair of being able to grab him, as I'm sure you're aware, prompting possibly the most dramatic draft miss ever. Detroit had not yet acquired Sheed, as they mulled over how to complete a roster so close and capable of making another finals run. You throw Melo on top of this team? Can't promise how long it meshes, how far it goes, whatever. I just know they'd have had a legitimate grip over the East for probably the rest of the 2000s depending on butterfly effects. For the current time, however, brother, Melo's Pistons comfortably ransacked the East, probably not struggling much until the Indiana series. Yes, let's explore Pistons Pacers real fast. I know you know how it ultimately ends, but it's because you know which causes me to doubt you've ever thought much about their 04 conference finals. It marked the first time in years there were two undeniable teams squaring off in a manner you could see playing out for a couple more years. In other words, some semblance of an entertaining trajectory. Unfortunately, this notion caught the boo early in the 05 campaign when the Malice at the Palace put an end to Indiana's young core, and Reggie Miller's career all at once. You can definitely see on their franchise index page, this is where the bottom came out, and they simply spiraled into a PG's era. Given the Pacers' first seed 61 win record in 04, and the fact they still took Detroit 6 in 05, their sudden absence would have appeared to clear the way totally for years to come, if not for Shaq's return. Very quickly after Mourning and Hardaway disappeared, Wade ushered in a new era of Miami Heat basketball, prompting Pat Riley to swing for the fences. O'Neal was just about to begin his final decline, still able to provide enough by Wade's side to contend. You probably guessed them and Detroit were the only 50-win squads in town, followed by mediocre roster after mediocre roster, or worse. Looking down there, it helped that the Orlando Magic, who had recently been forced to send T-Mac west, picked up Dwight Howard in 04's draft, officially setting the stage for legitimate future competition. Consider how we're only now discussing mid-2000s hoops, and the Magic have already been through 2 rebuilds. Shaq and Penny barely had a chance to get off the ground, then when Duncan spurned them, Hill's ankles were already complete mush, so we really didn't get a single day of the duo at full strength. Ray Allen also snuck off west at some point, leaving almost all of Milwaukee's success in the 80s. For the time being, all future hopes were on the back of a developing Michael Redd who'd just become an all-star. Jokes. His knees had exactly 4 seasons left. But hey, Eastern tenants could at least be a bit prideful, as for the first time since Jordan's days, Larry O'Brien was back with them after Detroit rebounded from drafting Darko Milicic by acquiring honorary Atlanta Hawks member Rasheed Wallace. A completed core was finally able to ascend, meeting Los Angeles and sticking a fork in the dynasty for good. Great feelings all around, but I would like to point out 2004's title is regarded the way it is because there's no world where it was supposed to happen. Yes, the best a feeble conference had to offer should have come up short once again by most accounts, and then proceeding to gentleman sweep an attempted super team was a massive upset. Point being, as good as they were, a rugged hard-working roster with Ben Wallace being the only all-star at the time had to be concerning, as championship teams built on set values rarely ever have long runs. Stars control all of this, plain and simple. Proving said point, I'm inclined to believe the only reason Flash and Diesel didn't knock them off the first time in 05 was due to Wade's injury. They could have actually done it in just 6 games. Instead, we had to wait a year, after Detroit had repeated as conference champs and gotten oh so close to handing San Antonio its first finals loss. Could you imagine a world where the Pistons beat both West superpowers in back-to-back years? Really a shame they couldn't get it done, because despite going on a run of 6 straight conference finals appearances, they'd simply missed the timing. The future of the East was officially rising. On try number 2, Miami got it done, advancing to the finals in just Wade's 3rd year. Of course, he went on to post a Herculean performance, bringing another title East from the hands of a Dallas team who absolutely could have won in 5 at worst. Part of the reason they were in the finals, having to go through a 64-win Detroit team, was due to how thin the roster had gotten. Same core, just not as much consistent support, cracking the door for Flash to push him over the top. Matter of fact, LeBron nearly second-rounded them with nothing close to a great roster, signaling he was very obviously getting ready to join contention conversations. If you couldn't see where things were headed, the 2-time Eastern representatives lost possibly their most important cog in the All-Star and Defensive Player of the Year, Ben Wallace. They'd still be good enough to survive their counterparts, just clearly not winning any more championships till further notice. So 54 wins, which would have made them the 4th best West team, kept them in the top position over regular season hoops. It was still a wounded Warrior who'd probably just fall to Miami again. Oh, except Miami didn't even get a chance to follow their previous shenanigans up, instantly succumbing to injuries and age, taking them from champs to 5th seed, 1st round outs who finished behind Toronto in the standings. Wow, we haven't checked on Bosh at all. I don't know whether he broke out because Vince Carter skipped town or if it was poised to happen anyway. Regardless, like T-Mac, half man, half amazing did not have an amazing time in the 6, where McGrady had abandoned him, then he only got barely over a year with Bosh, which wasn't enough time. Like trauma passed down from one generation to the next, VC passed a hopeless Raptors roster to Bosh, ready to waste valuable young years before he could make his own decisions. As mentioned earlier, Carter landed in New Jersey as Kid's running mate, and as also mentioned earlier, too late. VC and Kid sounds awesome, just a front court of Nenad Kristich, Jason Collins, and Clifford Robinson, negative floor spacing. I probably don't need to explain why they weren't ever winning a title or really scaring anybody, much less even going back to the finals. Cool lobs though. If we discussed Washington, we'd be having a very similar conversation. Top heavy, offensively talented, not championship or contending talented. Also got dropped off by year one playoff LeBron. Of course, LeBron. This was more or less the state of affairs by 2007. He'd been to the playoffs once, and his hopes of contention were already unraveling when the front office got finessed into letting Carlos Boozer out of a restricted contract. It might have been okay if they'd rebounded by landing Michael Redd in 05, only his heart was with Milwaukee because he didn't feel having a title would affect his career standing. Had he folded, LeBron claims they beat the Spurs in 07. He might be right, but the bigger point, depending on the butterfly effect with injuries, is Bron could have spent the rest of the 2000s next to a top shooting guard and not a random assortment of role players. In any case, the chosen one proved dominant enough to will maybe the second worst finals roster of the modern era atop the East, landing in front of a Spurs team they didn't have a prayer of beating. This finals matchup even being a thing spoke to the dire situation of disparity between conferences. Detroit? Wilting. Miami? Wilting. Nobody else was really close yet. San Antonio literally called dibs on the title behind closed doors as long as they could beat Phoenix. I've never heard anything like that from former players. It all doesn't even speak to the 8 teams sitting below 500. Meanwhile, the West 8th seed played spoiler to the 67-win 06 finals runner-ups. If this was all any indication, what even was the future of basketball here, where LeBron was being allowed to make finals appearances at age 22 with Larry Hughes as his second leading scorer? Enter the Boston Celtics, who were definitely caught in the middle of wasting Paul Pierce's prime, but I trust this made up for it. By 08, the Truth had made 5 All-Star teams, had 3 seasons with MVP mentions, was a top scorer, and had come within 2 wins of a finals trip years ago with an average roster. In the time since, well, Antoine Walker had basically been his career-long co-star. Just like most East rosters, they never completed the cast. This is also a theme I hope you're picking up on by now. While Kobe started off with Shaq, then picked up Gasol, Timmy got drafted to a contender, Nash started early with Dirk, then manned a perfect-fitting Suns roster, T-Mac got Yao as soon as he went west, you get the point. While Eastern stars maybe got a proper guy to play with at some point, out west it felt nearly guaranteed you'd get help in a timely manner. Hell, even look at Melo. Front office went out and fetched Iverson for him, then swapped for Billups shortly after when it wasn't progressing. Meanwhile, LeBron would eventually come to spend 7 years watching transaction after transaction while his team couldn't land a single one of them. Boston, who likely spent years crying at night over fumbling Tony Parker, absolutely cooked here by first trading for Ray Allen, then swinging a massive deal for Kevin Garnett, 2 West stars if you're keeping up. KG detailed how around this time, Paul had been telling him he didn't know if it'd be Minnesota or Boston, but they had to find their way to each other. Obviously they had, creating one of the first super teams of its kind. We'd seen some really good players drafted together, maybe eventually a team ended up super through the years. Summer 08 was the first time we'd ever experienced 3 perennial superstars joining forces at once, and it couldn't have happened at a more important time there. Without knowing exactly what else happens if said deal never transpired, we'd have probably been watching the same mediocre teams fight for the chance to be dominated by an actual contender in June. For reference, the 08 Cavs won just 45 games and were still technically in position to go back. If Boston doesn't form, they probably do go back. Given Miami had completely fallen off and sent Shaq west again, everything looked really familiar with Boston and Detroit being the only teams anyone would take seriously. You always consider LeBron, it's just the roster didn't come back a whole lot better than the one we just saw get swept. Every other team needed some lifeline, whether it meant a trade, drafting another piece, or flat out rebuilding. Had to be demoralizing knowing your starting point was trash, and if you did build something respectable, a pipe dream level big 3 with a deep bench was waiting for you at the top. Good luck. With all that being said, it's hilarious this was the era where the East began to rebound. The Celtics predictably won the title, posting 66 wins and surprisingly struggling to emerge, which we won't explore much cause it had more to do with Boston than anything in my opinion. After they'd finally been able to hoist a trophy for the first time since Bird, it was logical to ask who'd ever stop them now. Sure, there were unnecessary Game 7s, however, would anybody be able to catch them off guard after a year of gelling and winning? Well, it wouldn't be Detroit, who won the fakest 59 games I've ever seen. Not saying they weren't good, but their record implied they ever could have won when their replacements for Ben Wallace were Antonio McDyess and Jason Maxiell. Good guys, just no. Also, they agreed, breaking up the core in early 2009. Without the Pistons holding the line, Boston could essentially run the table as long as their stars' legs allowed, which wasn't long. Luckily for everyone else involved, Garnett's knee gave out for absolutely zero reason, going above and beyond to hinder what was shaping up to be a likely repeat, at least as conference champs. Without KG, certain teams had done just enough to be able to give them problems in a series. Take for instance Chicago, who'd spent the previous years towing the line between good and really good. They'd never gotten close to actually finishing the job, yet the roster was adequate enough by 2008 that when they cashed in on 1.7% odds to draft Derrick Rose, they were instantly talented enough for the playoffs. Then there was Orlando, who honestly posted a masterclass in roster building around what was quickly becoming a top center. Atlanta was on their way to never truly figuring out how to maximize a talented core, but it was still talented, as partly proven when they pushed the World Champ 7 a year earlier. All in all, 2009 was objectively the strongest East of the entire decade, with what was now a promising path forward. With Boston's front line completely thinned out, Orlando knocked them off, and the King as well, to make their mark, reaching the finals for the first time since Shaq. Upsetting the 66-win Cavs spoke volumes to our topic, because while LeBron had already reached superhuman status, he fueled them to regular seasons that were entirely deceiving of their long-term capabilities. These first stint Cleveland teams were nowhere near as bad as history has made them out to be. They also had no business contending with teams containing multiple all-stars or who were perfectly built from the inside out like Orlando. This basic truth would almost entirely shape the upcoming decade. I didn't mean to sleep on the Celtics Bulls first round and its implications. Even while hampered, most expected Boston to relatively cruise through round 1, only for it to become a top playoff series ever. Rose the rookie proved quite a bit ahead of schedule, while Chicago's core showed it could be dangerous as he developed. In LeBron, Boston, Orlando, and Chicago, you could somewhat see everything coming together. Maybe the East wouldn't be so weak after all. Superman had no luck against a superior West squad, much like the Superman who came before him, moving us to the 2010 season where the real story was the upcoming free agent gauntlet. Whatever happened this season would heavily affect power distribution going forward, as regardless of where stars had been drafted or spent their careers, most of them now had opportunities to control the rest of it. Recall how before 2010, and Boston's Big Three really, players hadn't felt so much pressure to jump ship in the name of a championship. In discussing his decision to spurn Cleveland, Michael Redd remarked, quote, "My heart was in Milwaukee because that was the team that kind of groomed me, and there was a loyalty that we as players had to our organizations back then. Back then, if you didn't win a championship, it didn't affect your legacy as far as how good you were. So if we didn't win a championship, I'd rather go down with the ship rather than join Kobe, join LeBron, Tracy McGrady, or Vince Carter." I feel his context is specifically important as we exit the 2000s, cause it's quite possible this mindset was responsible for how many East stars you saw just sitting idly by in dead-end situations. Completely unlike today where shit ain't popping by year 3 or 4, you're already hearing possible destinations for a guy who just got here. Pierce suffered a ton of average seasons before his title. Jason Kidd flat out chose to stay in New Jersey when he could have ran it up next to Duncan. Hell, up till 2010, it actually seemed like Braun might be a Cleveland lifer regardless of stagnant rosters. Boston, quote-unquote, buying a championship, as the discourse used to call it back in the day, really lit a fire under multiple stars who realized they'd either never see a finals or win one as long as they were around. It was also blatantly obvious by 2010's conclusion that if Garnett's knee hadn't blown out, they'd have been quite easily in their third straight finals. If you were LeBron, Wade, or Bosh playing next to 0 All-Stars most seasons, watching 3 of them continuously cruise by, you start to get some ideas. Specifically, if you were LeBron, it had to hurt knowing management kind of passed on an opportunity for a mid-season trade bringing in Amari Stoudemire, which almost certainly would have got them by Boston. When it was said and done, the Celtics had not won another title. They did, however, handle both Orlando and Cleveland rather swiftly after an entire regular season of critics saying they were old and had no shot. This was the East at the dawn of the 2010s. Not really a bad starting point headed to free agency. I might even say, at least near the top, it felt like they were catching up to the West. Then the first domino dropped. Instantly, 2 franchises went all the way to hell when Bosh and James left them to play with each other in a power grab so potent, it was expected to make them virtually unbeatable. Yet, I do have to point out the number of transactions in 2011 which totally set them up to be great going forward. Paul George was drafted by an Indiana team who were mostly just trying to find a way to win with Danny Granger. Little did they know, the core in progress would eventually support George as the number 1. Carlos Boozer and Darren Williams dispersed east, Booz going to Chicago as the consolation prize when they missed out on the Heatles, and Will being traded to New Jersey later on. Instead of waiting on a proper day to sign Melo, New York sent a massive haul west for him to join forces with Stoudemire, who they'd also picked off from the rival conference. Between Miami, Boston, Chicago, New York, and Orlando, the East was undeniably arising from the ashes of 2000's misery. which doesn't even account for the Atlantas, Phillies, or Indies who weren't contending while still being able to be optimistic. Also consider the Heatles' first tenure wasn't as dominant as expected, so by the postseason, it felt like Chicago and Boston were enough to keep parity intact. Then the postseason actually happened. Derrick Rose was the MVP. He was not LeBron James, however, and also didn't have other superstar teammates. He fell to Miami, the Celtics aged in dog years and fell to Miami, leaving us all kind of shell-shocked like, oh damn, maybe Miami will just run the table for a while. It wasn't so much about them conquering Boston finally, it was how it happened. The original Big Three looked old. So many guys had gotten injured, and Shaq, who they were depending on after trading Perkins, retired after discovering he could no longer run for a full season. In short, the recent power brokers were now broken. Meanwhile, the three on South Beach were young, spry, and very much appeared as if they could just do this as long as they wanted. A sentiment established when they dominated Chicago, completely flipping the script from the season sweep where the Bulls looked superior. If both the other top teams couldn't even compete in the series, what were the options for team building right now? One by one, everyone else was going to get their shot at LeBron, except he now had backup. So not only did those shots have no chance, we turned to an era where teams would simply have their futures stolen, one by one. Boston's deterioration process got underway quickly, looking like a mostly washed product in 2012 with no chance they could still win titles. Even their unexpected conference finals appearance had more to do with injuries and a lockout-influenced schedule. Without them helping to hold the line, responsibility would fall to Chicago, who would lose their MVP as soon as postseason play started. Tearing an ACL when it's basically May almost guarantees whatever hopes were held for next season were a lost cause as well. Whoops, it sounds like I just described the swift downfall of Miami's only two real roadblocks. What happened to Orlando after getting rocked by Kobe, you ask? They too began to dissolve, as moves they made for 2010 accelerated the timeline, and when it failed, 2011 brought a massive roster shakeup which resulted in a team nobody could truly say was any better. Of bigger concern was Dwight's contract talks, which appeared to get dicey at the exact moment the roster began stalling. D12 had definitely been the league's best center, even though contrarians used to have real arguments about Bynum, and he could instantly change the landscape with a proper decision. As it became clear there was trouble in Disneyland, rumors began to swirl. Could he end up in New York? What if he and Chris Paul move at the same time? New Jersey sounds legit. Didn't Orlando lose its first iteration of Superman to Los Angeles? Orlando would lose its second iteration of Superman to Los Angeles, after some of the weirdest public negotiations between a star and front office you'll ever see. If you're keeping score, Chicago, Boston, and Orlando practically fell out of meaningful conversations at the exact point in time LeBron seized power. Due to said events, all they had to contend with were Indiana's prequel, Boston's final chapter, and yeah, that's mostly it. The decade had just started, and the conference was already in dire straits moving forward if someone else couldn't organize quickly. As if things weren't bad enough, after years of mistreatment, Ray Allen took out revenge by joining Miami fresh off a title, adding elite floor spacing to a team who was already dominant. D-Rose pump faked the entire season about returning, meaning Chicago was virtually a non-factor in what was likely the best season of Joakim Noah's career. At face value, the only team even worth a damn when discussing Miami was New York, who put together a supercharged roster around Melo in light of missing out on both CP3 and Dwight. Other than that, the fact the 56-win Grit and Grind Grizz would have qualified for second seed here tells you all you need to know. Teams were battered by injury, stuck in their building processes, or withering from their previous era. After Roy Hibbert nearly broke his hand ruining the Knicks' dream season, they became next in line to challenge the throne, with a slight bit of confidence to work with. Sure, they were probably only up 2-1 the previous year, in heavy credit to Bosch's absence. However, you could already see a developing pecking order during said series, and PG now had the green light with Granger succumbing to his injuries. This is important to note for our topic. Indy for the 2010s going forward could have rolled out either George and Granger or George and Kawhi. Both opportunities evaded them, so when they surprisingly came within a game of eliminating Miami, the missing piece was glaring. Actually, the same could be said for 2014, when management disturbed the recipe by adding Evan Turner in an attempt to bolster wing strength. It backfired and ended up causing team issues. Meanwhile, not only would Chicago ultimately fail in getting Rose any superstar help, he'd also mostly missed the 14 season after an upsettingly random knee injury. Afterward, there was a whole scenario where Carmelo Anthony would bounce from the Big Apple, who failed to reach even a conference finals, and help the Windy City breeze over the hump. When he changed his mind based on some extracurricular factors, they settled for an older Gasol, which was a brilliant move, just not as exciting as an established star wing scorer next to Rose would have been. This same summer, PG broke his leg, removing all the wind from the sails of a franchise who was just getting up off the mat after a decade. I don't know, it sounds like I just told you the teams who were supposed to replace the old contenders now also needed to be replaced. Coming into 2014, Brooklyn attempted a power play, mortgaging their future on a 36 and 37-year-old Pearson Garnett. Sheesh, looking back, I can't even believe they went so hard into former All-Stars who were coming up on 40. Those two were certainly better players the season before than anyone will remember, but anyone dealing for them had to know it was a one-season window. Still, placing them next to Deron Williams, Joe Johnson, and Brook Lopez was tactically kind of brilliant considering everyone was under the impression they needed a super team to compete. Here they were supposed to be insulated, not needing to carry as hard as they did for a Ray Allen-less and later Rondo-less Celtics squad. Anyways, it didn't work. Lopez, who was coming off an all-star season, appeared in only 17 games after a foot injury. It wasn't even good for KG to be the lone big man on the roster 4 years earlier when Perkins got hurt and later traded. It got ugly in Brooklyn. His days were clearly done. And here, almost midway through the decade, you start to understand the hampered East you've grown up with. Contenders got injured, their replacements got injured, and these franchises who had little to no momentum to begin with were being tasked with figuring out Braun, Wade, and Bosh, who at this point could really coast through regular seasons as needed. Take for instance a number that'd be called a few years down the line. Washington had gone through the Arenas era already, which, while entertaining, never produced anything better than a semifinals appearance. It also crashed and burned toward the end when No Chill Gil brought a gun into the locker room, putting an official end to an already ending era considering his knee injuries. He got a tiny bit of time on the roster with John Wall, their new draftee who'd take the mantle of leading a franchise with next to no chance of future success. No exaggeration, by the way. A clip recently dropped of Sam Cassell talking about how at some point Wall came to him crying because of all the losing, wondering if it'd ever improve. No, it wouldn't improve, it'd probably get worse. Sam gave it to him straight. Another franchise stuck in the fill-in for the fill-ins tier was Toronto, who were just now beginning to get looks because, bro, there was nobody left. The DeRozan and Lowry Raptors a few years earlier would have been considered the Atlanta Hawks in that, yeah, they were a good basketball team, exciting even. They just had no business being near the top. And seasons where they were probably as good as a 4th or 5th seed, they were finishing 2nd or 1st and ending up in conference finals. Speaking of Atlanta, they played a relevant role in this discourse starting 2015. If you're too young to remember 2000's ATL, again, the best comparison, just in terms of tiers, would be Toronto in my opinion. Not play style, not identity, tiers. A team who could post impressive records, create highlights, stopping just shy of actual contention. I'd say the highest they got was after adding Jamal Crawford. It's the only time you looked and said, huh, how far can they go really? Either way, 2008's random Boston surprise was literally the best it ever got. The next years consisted of expected 1st and 2nd round outs, while slowly losing guys from the Highlight Factory era. Even so, by 2015, management turned the bleeding into the most random 60-win team of all time. I'm so serious. The 2014 Hawks won 38 games. You immediately point to injuries for, say, an Al Horford, but health at no point was the difference between mediocre and 60 wins with 4 All-Stars. It's no wonder they had no staying power. It wasn't really legit. A team with 60 wins and 4 All-Stars was normally either traded together and about to go on a long run, or drafted together and also about to go on a long run. Very rarely do you ever see one just pop into existence then disappear without a trace. The team basketball was cool. You could see discourse shifting to call them the Spurs of the East. It was probably a really exciting time for a city that quite literally had only been dealing with mid as long as they had a team. However, I feel like most of us called BS immediately. You just weren't gonna look me in the eye and convince me All-Stars Jeff Teague and Kyle Korver were about to move the needle in May. And it was all bad, because on top of everything listed here about the mid-2010s East, and yes, the pun was intended, LeBron re-upped with a new big three after his former group was falling off the bone. Miami went 2-2 over the Heatles era, a relatively disappointing mark considering the starting point and expectations. Either way, Braun clearly saw the writing on the wall and took his opportunity to finish affairs in Cleveland once they'd had a couple years bringing Kyrie up, and their draft capital was perfect collateral for a 3rd star. Kyrie, Bron, and Love were 22, 30, and 26 at the time of joining. Their window was at least going to be as long as Miami's, and probably a bit longer if everything went smooth. They placed second to Atlanta, having the normal early issues a team with multiple stars usually faces. Chicago hung around, nearly losing Rose again in what was clearly going to be their best shot ever at winning. Then you immediately run to Toronto, who were already being posted on Fraud Watch for letting Brooklyn get one over on them in the playoffs while their two stars shrank under bright lights. When I tell you every other team in the conference was either at the beginning or maybe middle of a rebuild process, it's not an exaggeration. To hold the line this time and block LeBron from fairly easily achieving his 5th straight finals, our options were a Derrick Rose whose knees were hanging on for dear life after multiple surgeries, and yeah, there wasn't a single other unit anybody had real belief in, which was starting to get old already. Ever since Bron took team building into his own hands, his group routinely only had one real challenge, and the challenger probably wouldn't have got so far if not by default. Meanwhile, the West was putting out no less than 3 teams who could win it all at a time, and probably more. Kevin Love got knocked out early with a shoulder injury. You never knew when Kyrie was gonna run out of gas every time he started limping, yet Cleveland still only lost 2 matches on the way to play Golden State. As we've reached this point, I'm starting to realize the conference as a whole had the combined misfortune of the Clippers, cause even this playoff bracket should have featured a competitive Miami team who didn't get the chance after losing Bosh. Like I said, the fill-ins for the fill-ins were getting knocked. Melo took the money as mentioned earlier, content to toil away on a team headed toward rebuilding. It does feel relevant to mention while Bron was running everybody's fade, Joel Embiid and Giannis were drafted to the Sixers and Bucks respectively, key cogs in what would give the East the most hope it had since the early 2010s. By 2016, it was pretty clear whatever team LeBron blessed was going to the finals, with very little discussion in between. If you need any reminder of how bleak the situation was, Toronto made second seed, serving as the only deterrent from another Cavs win. An honor which should have belonged to Miami, except they received a near identical script to the year prior, losing Bosh and ending any real hopes for a run which still managed to bump shoulders with a conference finals appearance. ATL predictably fell off, Georgia's Pacers were significantly weaker post-injury, Chicago fell back to pre-Derrick Rose records after he picked up another injury, and there wasn't much more to look at. LeBron James had taken total control at a time where it was becoming rare for a team to even have the proper infrastructure to create worthy competition in a timely manner. Take Boston, who were doing a good job rebounding from the big 3, yet were still years away from really moving anyone. With this being the palette, Cleveland again lost only 2 games, headed toward a rematch with Golden State, becoming only the 4th Eastern franchise to capture a title since 1998. Look alive though, their 3-1 comeback heavily influenced the biggest free agent decision since LeBron himself in 2010. The funny part about Durant's move was virtually any good team he signed with would have instantly been put pretty far over the top. In the West, these teams you heard him considering were Boston, Miami emerged as a dark horse, and both locations would have been like, okay I guess, but then there's gotta be more moves. As we know, he chose Golden State, making it impossible for other teams in general to have a real shot at championships. Through the course of 2017, his move triggered Cleveland to further improve, widening the gap between them and the rest of an already inferior conference. If you need examples, first seed wound up going to an Isaiah Thomas-led Celtics, which tells you everything you need to know. Remember the whole fill-in for the fill-in conversation? We were so collectively desperate by LeBron's potential 7 straight finals run, discourse began about how Washington sorta maybe kinda stood a chance because John Wall's speed could be problematic. Only we'd literally watched this story years earlier when Rose spent the regular season dominating, only to catch a bad case of the bronze during postseason. I doubt James was the same defender by 2017. I also doubt Wall was gonna do enough damage to beat Cleveland 4 times. He disagrees though. Quote, "I'm telling you, if you interview anybody on the Cavs, that was one team they did not want to see in the East. Me and Kyrie, we matching up. I'm taking Brad over JR. You got Braun over Trevor Ariza. Kevin Love and Markieff Morris. I'm taking Kevin Love, but Markieff Morris can shoot threes and post up. I'm taking Gortat over Tristan Thompson, and our bench was deeper than theirs." Okay, for the purposes of this flick, the important concept here is we were down to discussing if the Wizards could revive conference parity. Yeah, this time Cleveland lost only once on the way to a finals they couldn't win. While it certainly sucked to sit through, luckily the seeds for prosperity had quietly been planted. Look at Milwaukee, who, if you can believe it, had been relatively quiet since the 80s. There was a decent stretch with Ray Allen, it just didn't go anywhere and wasn't necessarily long. After getting screwed out of the Red era by injury, they mostly flip-flopped back and forth between rosters that were either average or below. If you recall Monte Ellis's random stint next to Brandon Jennings, it was actually supposed to include Steph Curry, who would have been a buck if Mark Jackson hadn't stepped in. Instead of enjoying the greatest shooter of all time, headed into 2018, they were nurturing a Greek freak of nature. He'd been the kid everyone looked at years earlier, fearful of his untapped potential. Year by year, rather than toil away and disappoint as most prospects would with such lofty expectations, he was growing into them, alongside Chris Middleton, who'd been quietly finessed from Detroit. Then there was Philly, who after an extended period near the bottom, were finally ready to start the process on the backs of Ben Simmons, who drew LeBron comparisons, and Embiid, who was miraculously bouncing back from multiple anti-big man injuries. You're probably not wondering where they've been all this time since Iverson's tenure, and it's because even when they were one game away from the conference finals in 2012, there was nothing believable happening there. AI and Iggy had a couple cool highlights, but once Answer got traded, there was an extreme stretch of mediocrity, which eventually gave way to flat-out tanking once Andre also went to Denver. By 2018, the long and painful process of drafting a contender seemed to be bearing fruit, as they earned 50 wins for the first time since 2001. Hopefully it helps you understand how non-existent they were for so long. Fortunately, the wealth spread a bit over summer when Cleveland, after their second loss to KD's Warriors, hit a snag and were forced to deal Kyrie Irving to Boston right before LeBron got ready to decide on his contract. The Celtics had already pried Gordon Hayward out of Utah, on top of having used Brooklyn's blunder to draft Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum. Quiet as kept, the next great Eastern superpower was already under construction, in a world where they'd probably just make the finals right then and there with no freak accidents. Of course, here in 2024, you know that season was filled with them, in a way which would disturb their process during 2019, helping cause significant underperformance from a talented roster. Then there was the curious case of the Raptors. Here's what Toronto did and didn't do by 2018. They didn't put together a roster around Lowry and DeRozan that moved anybody. Good for sure, almost 60 wins, and there were still many of us picking LeBron and company to eliminate them. They did put together a roster capable of elevating a more talented number one, which they'd come into shortly. Perfect timing too, because with LeBron's exit, the oven timer went off. Milwaukee was now contending under Giannis, the newly minted superstar turning into an absolute unit, poised to step into the vacant throne soon, if not now. After their most successful campaign in franchise history, Toronto decided the power of friendship wasn't cutting it, swooping in and stealing Kawhi at the peak of his powers. Philly saw the opportunity and cut early deals for both Tobias Harris and Jimmy Butler, unknowingly creating what would remain the greatest team of the process era. Well, maybe 24 is better, we really don't know yet. Either way, between Boston, Philly, Toronto, and Milwaukee, it was the first time the East had 4 teams who could be strongly considered for a title since... wait, was it ever a thing? Because even in 2010, you'd struggle to get 3. It really might be the only time since the retro days. Also consider, these were 4 title-worthy teams in a normal year. In 2019, they were only winning if something happened to Golden State. The rest of the East was otherwise pretty mundane as usual, although the entire NBA was headed for better days. Toronto winning the title in the manner they did initiated a new era, knocking Golden State off its pedestal and sharing Durant east. Headed for the 2020s, we received the duo era, where super teams were prospectively a thing of the past. Only issue is, if you peep at the graphic created to ring it all in, most duos who moved anybody were on West teams. Sure, Durant and Kyrie were set to write a new chapter in Brooklyn, only KD would take about a year before holding up his end of the deal due to the Achilles. Considering Kawhi also went west after winning a championship, and Philly lost Jimmy Butler due to some interesting decision making, 2020 looked as if it erased quite a bit of progress in a short time. Remember, there were 4 teams strong enough to win a regular year. 2020 was a regular year, and if you really stretched it, you could maybe justify seeing 3 teams that way. In reality, Milwaukee, who had a 70-win pace by February, was probably the only actual title contender there. Toronto held its own without Kawhi, as did Boston without Kyrie, and I just don't think either of those get the nod over a couple West rosters. Speaking of those two for a sec, interesting case studies. You look at the Celtics 5-man picture and think if grown organically, it was a unit capable of long-term greatness, even though I guess they technically figured it out and stayed on the same track. Toronto as well. With some tweaks, knowing Kawhi's body, there were maybe 2 more years left to dominate. Instead, both franchises were relegated maybe 1 tier down for the time being, which still made for more parity than usual, just not necessarily the healthy 2019 starting point they had. This fully explains Brooklyn's attempted power grab for 2021. When Boston seized power in 08, it was at a somewhat similar point in terms of strength. One believable contender, a lot of possible potential lurking around, but otherwise an amazing chance to basically get a bye to the finals. In January 2021, Brooklyn executed a deal to land a dissatisfied James Harden on top of Durant and Irving. With no notes needed, they instantly became conference champion favorites, as we now understood the power of big threes and super teams. Whichever you as a fan classified them under, three of the most talented offensive players to ever bless the league sharing a court? Let's go home. Funny enough, Nets management had basically been known to swing for the fences by now, only to end up fruitless. VC and Kid did some cool things nobody really remembered due to the 500 records and postseason finishes. D. Will and Joe Johnson ushered in Brooklyn basketball, only to watch it squander once new owners went all in on senior citizens. Now here they were, after nearly a decade of suffering from essentially trading the duo who'd come to dominate the East. For the time being, a superpowered trio gave the illusion fans could now laugh at Boston for believing they heisted titles with the old deal. It'd be the Nets who'd win first after all. Or Miami, who, by the way, were the reigning conference champs. Quickly too, after a stretch of wadeless basketball which resulted in mediocrity and no clear direction. Looking back, going from the 2019 Heat, who don't even exist in most people's memory, to 2 wins away from gold is remarkable. Only problem, their finals run was considered that of a dark horse in the first place, mostly due to criticism after signing Jimmy Butler. Nobody could quite figure out why he chose in Miami's roster of all places if he cared about winning. Then a little over a year later, we were watching him will an injured squad to challenge LA. The consensus after defeat was they absolutely had to get another recognizable star, as if you looked at all the past champs, the days of winning a good old-fashioned blue-collar title were completely over, not that they were ever prominent to begin with. After Riley had swung winning deals in the past, Heat faithful would spend the 2020s waiting for one more miracle deal, a deal which to this point simply never came. 2021 proved to be an extension of the COVID season, which predictably created some openings for franchises who otherwise wouldn't have had a chance. I'm looking at the Atlanta Hawks, who I've barely needed to mention so far. After the 2 eras before, Trae Young was drafted in 2018 to hopefully lead a new and more successful era. Despite management not having actually built a contender yet, they were on track to be in a finals featuring second option John Collins. Not to knock him, but I'm sure you understand the implications. They're surely a weird case though, cause I've never seen the sense in saying their run was a fluke aided by COVID. Case in point, they handled Philly pretty fair and square. Sure, there was the usual Embiid ailments, yet no legit excuses as to why they couldn't, as a first seed, beat the 5th seed they were unquestionably more talented than. I guess where I'm going with all this is, the Eastern Conference Finals were between a team who had already been expected to win the title by now, and a team people would have laughed at you for believing in. Worse, they were very likely only playing Milwaukee because, in typical Nets fashion, injuries completely dismantled the trio, as they would for the remainder of their time together. A Brooklyn super team, who probably should have been making life miserable for everyone over the next few years, barely saw any time together in general, as the Stars only shared the court for 16 games, winning 13 if it means anything to you. Due to the chaos, Harden skipped town after barely even getting a full year of play there. Another potential bright spot of the East dying like any other man. By the NBA's 75th season, I will at least concede the East was interesting enough that we didn't have a real clue who was coming out of it. Brooklyn spent more time injured, but still contained both Durant and Irving, who, when healthy, showed signs they could potentially give problems to whatever higher seed drew them in round 1. Philly with Embiid and Harden was supposed to be a perfect fit, albeit nearly impossible to enjoy watching. Milwaukee was fresh off their first title since the Kareem days, poised to continue dominating considering their foot was now in the door. Didn't matter how Brooklyn probably would have killed them if healthy, they were never healthy, and also now not really a thing. Miami got back in the mix after a down year, finishing as first seed, while Boston posted one of the biggest in-season turnarounds ever, going from a 500 team to literal contenders on the heels of discussions about whether Jaylen Brown was getting traded. In the shadows, even Chicago was looking more trustworthy than they had in nearly a decade. Although D Rose went down in 2012, management hadn't moved off of him until 2017, cracking open an insanely tweener rebuild roster which added Rondo and Wade out of nowhere. From day one, nobody knew how the trio made sense, except it was pretty clear they'd have eliminated Boston if Rondo's hand didn't break, potentially setting them up for a conference final showdown with LeBron. After this fell apart, 2022 marked their first playoff appearance since, having achieved a very competitive roster through mostly trade. They even reached high points which fooled me into believing them title contenders. Although Lonzo's injury definitely changed course, I feel comfortable saying they still weren't ready. They might have been though. This makes the Lonzo reference important, cause I'd wager to say Chicago's gambit failed almost entirely due to his knee. Ball hasn't seen action since the 35 games he played in 22. These days trying to convince us he'll ever actually play again. Even if he does, the window is closed, and like a ton of Eastern teams before them, it was due to injury. The defensive tandem of he and Caruso, DeRozan's unbelievable offensive ability, Levine sharing a wing with him, and Vooch when he decided to hit shots. It was a group only a couple pieces away from making real noise, and instead today, they suffer yet another rebuild from a disappointing era since the Jordan days. Boston was able to put money where their mouths were, reaching the finals for the first time since 2010. It came after just narrowly squeezing by Miami, which spoke directly to the power balance here. Roster-wise, you could argue Boston should have wrapped it up a bit quicker or easier, yet something about Miami was enabling them to keep getting so close. Not that they weren't talented, it's just you couldn't honestly say Butler had a real duo partner. You could say Bam, but I think you all know what I mean. A real number 2 would have been any of the names constantly floating around. Names Riley was sure to get his hands on with a now second place finish and Game 7 conference finals loss at home. Yet when Donovan Mitchell was finally on the move, it was to Cleveland. When Durant moved later in 2023, it was to Phoenix. Those were just the main misses, by the way. It seemed irrelevant because in a conference finals rematch with Boston, they came out on top after nearly blowing a 3-0 lead, only to once again predictably not stand a chance to finish. In essence, one of the East's best teams of the 2020s has had virtually no shot at winning any final series they appeared in, and we can finally now say they never figured it out. Window's closed, man. Jimmy hasn't re-signed, no significant moves. 2025 is going to be another round of, could the Heat actually do it? After spending a whole season with main characters in and out of the lineup. Hopefully 2024 was an eye-opener. Not hinging so much on the fact they lost to Boston again, Jimmy didn't even play. The important factor there is, what was the plan even if he did? After a few swings and misses, Brad Stevens went out and redid the roster, trading key players for guys who instantly made them way better than they'd ever been. It was so potent, I spent 2024 saying if they didn't win it now, it just wasn't gonna happen. What more could you even do to a roster around Tatum and Brown? Thankfully, we aren't having this convo. Instead, we're talking about a Boston repeat coming from a run through a conference nobody respected. Wait, the last time I did an overview, sure the conference didn't look as good as it could have, but where did the weak talks emerge? Well, luck, or lack thereof. 2024's slate wasn't unrecognizable from when the decade started. Matter of fact, I'd call it impressive. You've probably noticed by now I've made almost no mentions of the mecca of basketball throughout this hour or so, and it's because I haven't totally needed to. First off, let it be known how since the 90s, they've been poorly managed the majority of the time, going through brutal stints authored by owner James Dolan. Once the Melo era finally wrapped up in 2017, they quickly moved their biggest rebuild piece in Kristaps Porzingis, confusing fans at the time as to why you'd give up on a unicorn after 3 seasons. Starting over from here, it took 4 years to become competitive, featuring a roster which laid the groundwork for what they hope is true contention in 2025. By season's end, they collected their first 50-win campaign since 2013, giving way to even more hope over summer when they massively improved after getting their start to do something you rarely see in modern times: take a pay cut. As a matter of fact, I can vividly remember being in a Twitter space during the 2023 finals with Robert Horry, and him laughing at the mere idea I presented of someone doing something like this. It used to be a thing. Here it felt necessary because objectively they'd only been built at the time to maybe give Boston a headache in a series. Now, with a few plays going their way, it ain't so hard or crazy to believe they could beat them. Where were they for this postseason though? Injured. To hell. What was very likely a conference finals appearance turned into a second round out when by the end of the Indiana series, Brunson could barely walk and multiple other guys were either injured or out. Milwaukee got injured out of round 1 in their inaugural Dame season. Donovan Mitchell played 3 games of the Boston series. Halliburton played 2 for Indy. Embiid would have had no chance to go on a run even if they beat New York. And back to square one, Miami came in at 8th seed, missing multiple guys all year. Long story short, y'all thought I forgot this vid. Everything in life is optics. You've probably figured out by now the East wasn't weak, it was injured. Injured while a juggernaut hung around the top, serving as the only 60-win team in the entire league. It's just when said juggernaut basically gets a bye to the finals because nearly everyone else is hurt. No, everyone else was hurt, and even if they had been healthy, deep down the most sensible fans realized none of them beat Boston in a series regardless. So yeah, terrible optics and a very easy opportunity to call the East weak. This isn't unfounded, by the way. If you recall, 2024 was like one of 3 or 4 runs we've discussed so far where we could have experienced greatness or something close, then injury snatched it. Think 2012, post 2014, hell, probably throw 2007 in there. Why does it feel it never happens to the West? Well, the margin for error is simply so much higher. Although I'll point out 24 was damn near an anomaly with the amount of East injuries. Still, years where we probably should have had LeBron and Rose squaring off, or Georgia's Pacers in the mix, we were pretending Lowry and DeRozan stood a chance cause they randomly tied a series back in 2016. Since we're nearing the end, let's touch on some teams we either haven't explored at all or need to examine more. Then take a brief look at what the West was doing all those years, and finally, briefly look at how the draft played its part over time. Charlotte. Have I even mentioned their existence? Unlikely, because after tormenting us with the Bobcats expansion, they quite literally have done almost nothing significant for the NBA, yet alone their conference. It really goes back to the beginning when contract disputes led to Alonzo Mourning bolting from Miami. After some halfway decent outings in the early 2000s, the Bobcats wasted 10 years, only to return to Hornets branding, which, while fire, has literally been worn to present nothing for fans. Kemba Walker, LaMelo Ball, and a whole lot of mid or below. Only now, after they missed out on Wemby of course, is there even some excitement over their, hopefully, cornerstone Brandon Miller. It's really the most exciting thing to take place in Charlotte since Jordan became an owner and gave illusions he could transfer his greatness downward. We all know how that went. Oof, Detroit. Also haven't mentioned these guys since 09, cause somehow it feels like trading Chauncey Billups for a declining AI ended their entire franchise. Actually, because their only playoff appearances since then have been 2 first-round outs in the late 2010s, I don't feel out of place saying they're basically still trying to rebuild from the 04 unit. Went through a whole lot of nothing for a decade, randomly went in for the last of Blake Griffin's good days, and have mostly just been praying they finally hit a couple more times in the draft. Seeing as how Kate Cunningham's first 3 years have been 24 wins or below with very few encouraging roster improvements, I wouldn't be surprised in a couple of years when, yeah, you know. One day we're gonna deep dive how Atlanta has quite literally been the definition of mid through just about its entire existence. It's been more of the same since their random 2021 run. Credit to them for trying to capitalize by bringing in DeJounte Murray, only it feels like the world knew these two in the backcourt together weren't moving the needle much. Sucks for Trey too, because as he revealed recently, it could have and should have been Anthony Edwards. Boy, the rest of the league dodged a bullet. Instead of building around those two to elevate Peachtree basketball throughout the decade, we're now in Trae Young's trade saga, which, take notes, Cade, yuck. Washington feels like one of those franchises who will just never figure it out. The 2000s were at least entertaining as we went over, then it was followed up by a Wall and Bill era where their ceiling was likely a conference finals and they barely even got close. After injuries and mediocre rosters spoiled around 5 to 7 years of opportunity, well, you can guess by their lack of mentions the only way they would have been relevant was if they landed Wemby, like a couple other franchises. Instead, we've got this extraordinarily weird time with Westbrook averaging another triple-double in their threads, playoff misses while they inexplicably gave Beal a crazy contract before later trading him, and now we wait, like we've been waiting. Cleveland post LeBron has actually gone better than you probably expected. Instead of another infinite rebuild, the front office went all in on Donovan Mitchell, who they were lucky enough to extend over summer when it very much appeared he was likely to say goodbye. As is a recurring theme on this side of the bracket, however, injuries have more or less hampered the unit's potential. Even though when healthy, they're still probably a couple pieces away from talking about another championship. Congratulations to Indiana, who just made its first conference final since the PG era, which we kinda left off on. Losing 2015 to his leg injury, he came back to a roster about half as strong as the earlier units. What followed was a string of first round outs, including the newer rosters with Oladipo. For a second it appeared they wouldn't miss a beat, immediately pushing out a competitive roster after sending George West. As is a recurring theme on this side of the bracket, however, in January 2019, Victor suffered a ruptured tendon in his knee, basically ruining his career at age 26. Cue another rebuilding montage taking us to present day where they probably gave Boston the best fight of anyone. Although he couldn't play through it all, Tyrese Halliburton has ushered in a new era of Pacers basketball, with management immediately doing work to build something competitive around him. The kicker is, they definitely just make the playoffs last year too without, you guessed it, injuries. Milwaukee has just been fortunate and unfortunate at the same time for a decade. Fortunately, their gamble on Giannis paid off. How many times have we heard some prospect was gonna break basketball, only for them to disappear into darkness? After winning a title 8 years later by heeding his warnings and making roster improvements, they've mostly been, as is a recurring theme on this side of the bracket, injured. Immediately after taking 2021, Middleton's absence no doubt altered the Celtics series result. Last year, Giannis fell on his back, which also absolutely altered the result. Then their blockbuster acquisition got hurt against Indiana when Giannis had already been sidelined headed into postseason, which again altered the result. So for 3 straight years, one of the few Eastern title teams since the year 2000 haven't even had a real shot to follow it up. Great deal for Lillard in any case. I feel at this point they may have gotten him a year or so too late, but you have to admire how Giannis says something in the media and management gets to work. Lessons have been learned since LeBron's decision. As a native of Orlando myself, it genuinely feels like the Magic have been rebuilding from the Dwight Howard era this entire time, only now starting to turn the corner with a cohort of young, exciting talent. After the weird standoff between Superman and their GM, they really just cycled through young guys who they'd eventually send elsewhere to actually blossom, which is just insult to their old injuries. Not only did all their stars want to leave for greener pastures, those nondescript role-player rosters of the mid-2010s all wound up finding some type of success in their new homes, or most of them did. During present day though, they've got a chance. Paolo is a very clear future superstar, while the supporting cast will hopefully continue to take form, and we aren't stuck talking about that one time they almost made the second round. Philly has now been through like 3 or 4 iterations of the process, with, as is a recurring theme on this side of the bracket, injuries routinely ruining any shot. I have a whole video on Embiid's misfortunes so far, and while 2025 would appear to be his best supporting cast, just sit and watch. They're either going to be really good and finally break through, or neither PG or Embiid will be available in the playoffs. Literally no in between. Toronto simply tried hanging on too long after Kawhi left, as if they just couldn't believe they finally reached the top, only to lose it in what I'd consider a rare scenario. And if you're a Raptors fan, you're probably scared, cause all you're really used to is idle time. Vince not being able to do much, then leaving after T-Mac left, Bosh spending years alone only for Andre Bargnani to be the hope, landing at Lowry and DeRozan routinely pump faking. Luckily, Scotty Barnes isn't just going to be all-star, he is all-star. Even then, we've got zero guarantee this era won't just drag on for a while, as they never really amount to anything. After all, that's been the more common outcome, as is a recurring theme on this side of the bracket. And finally, we're back to Brooklyn, who are themselves back to square one after another quick power grab attempt failed. We just, yearly at this point, spend time scrolling past Ben Simmons edits, and a reminder he's still in the league, because after being one of many most hyped prospects since LeBron, you get it by now. Brooklyn isn't banking on Ben anyway. For a second, the future looked bleak, yet they've managed to rebuild their draft capital, which would have been a massive issue if left unchecked. Similar to Toronto, they could strike gold, or they could bottom feed for years to come. Stay tuned. Speaking of draft capital, now we can talk about the history-changing picks which played a part in the disparity. Here's a visualization of major picks since 2000 and which side they were either drafted to or ended up making the most noise in. Looking back, you begin to question what even would have happened here if, say, Denver got the first pick in 03. Does he even ever come east at any point? LeBron more or less ran the 2010s there. I wonder if a proper long-term challenger to Western squads ever arises without him, or would it have been a prolonged version of the early 2000s? Hypothetically, 2 Eastern teams could have had Chris Paul in 05, instead going with Andrew Bogut and Marvin Williams. Know that through some of these, a franchise just might not have needed to draft a certain position, causing them to miss out on a legend, which in itself altered history. Chicago drafted future elite big man LaMarcus Aldridge in 06, trading him west for Tyrese Thomas and Victor... I really should have just looked it up before I started recording. It's not happening now. For reference, they eliminated the defending champion Heat in 2007 without Aldridge on the roster. I'm a little pissed they didn't get to put him beside Ben Wallace for a year. I just would have liked to have seen how far they go, considering Cleveland was apparently enough. The 2 top picks of 07 went west, meaning Greg Oden and KD would be joining an already hectic conference. Immediately following him up, Westbrook could have potentially been a Heatle, getting passed up on for Michael Beasley, who... Anyways, making matters worse, he joined forces with Durant, creating a formidable squad after also picking up Harden for years to come, mostly squandered by injury. How about the New York Knicks missing out on Steph Curry by 1 pick? The first question it raises is, would the Knicks of the late 2000s have actually nurtured him properly? For the purposes of this vid, however, I'll choose to believe he was tapping into his greatness one way or the other. The miss marks the second time we've seen how Curry could have blossomed with an East team, possibly battling LeBron from year to year for domination of the conference. Kawhi also could have blossomed with an East team, the very East team he was drafted by right before they started challenging LeBron and the Heatles, right before Kawhi started challenging LeBron and the Heatles. Instead, the wing duo would doom themselves by trying to succeed with the Clippers later on. Oh, this is nasty. If you just flip the order for the first 2 picks of 2012's draft, Charlotte lands Anthony Davis and probably squanders him, let's be real, New Orleans did it anyway. You can't deny how badly 2013's East needed him going forward. In his place, the Bobcats were left with Michael Kidd-Gilchrist. No notes needed. 3 East teams massively benefited from starting off 2014's draft, only if you didn't scroll down, you'd miss how Denver lucked into one of the best players ever at pick 41. Obviously, nobody could have 100% predicted his trajectory, which doesn't stop it from being hilarious how, all things considered, not one Eastern franchise lucked out enough to grab and develop him. Okay. Atlanta definitely picked one of the awesomest offensive engines in quite some time. They still missed Luka Doncic, I'm sorry. No clue what they have around him right now, but a potential future top 15-ish, top 10 guy ever got traded west. Also just made the NBA Finals, by the way. Then of course there was Charlotte continuing to ensure its own downfall, sending Shai Gilgeous to the Clippers for Miles Bridges and Jerome Robinson. Good lord, man. New Orleans got Zion, Memphis got Ja, New York got RJ Barrett. Next. We've already been over Ant's potential Atlanta landing, I'll just be patiently waiting for the rest of the story. And that brings us to what I consider a generational moment. Moments like Jordan going to Chicago, Braun to Cleveland, etc. Detroit, Charlotte, and Washington were all praying to the aliens above for Wemby to come down and save them. A player with potential virtually impossible for any franchise to squander. Hell, I don't even think mid-2000s Donald Sterling could have fucked this off. Anyway, of course he went to San Antonio, which reminds me, they also got the first pick in Duncan's draft, leaving Philadelphia with Keith Van Horn. You heard that right. If the ping pongs bounced differently, AI would have had Tim Duncan right out the gate. Instead, his center for the only finals appearance of his career was an older Mutombo, which also reminds me, there are probably so many ping pong what ifs similar to this we simply don't have time to broach here. But as consolation, from earlier, just imagine Philly pairing AI with any of these guys you've heard about today. Unreal misfortune. We've reached the home stretch, where I felt it important to include the West triumphs over these time periods to contextualize why the East has even sometimes felt weaker than it really was. Chicago's dynasty more or less handed the baton to San Antonio and LA, both of which prevailed through the entire 2000s. These 2 franchises won 7 of the 10 available chips. This fact may cause you to ask, then well, what was so great about the West if 2 teams controlled most of it? Oh buddy, just like how Jordan's Bulls kept a lot of great teams and stars ringless, it gets even deeper here. While Shaq, Kobe, Timmy, and his crew were raking in ring after ring, you had a squad like Sacramento who went through a brutal stretch of painful exits, ultimately never even seeing the finals when I can nearly guarantee they do so on the other side. Here's another visualization of teams and players who were simply footnotes in their stories. Yes, those run-and-gun Suns who, and I quote, could not imagine not winning a championship, surely helped change basketball, only to never make a finals. Boozer and Williams are almost completely forgotten, solely because they were plates for the Kobe and Gasol Lakers. Minnesota had a halfway decent shot in 04, and although injuries really shut them out, it never felt like they beat the Lakers even with Gasol. Just because I'm convinced there's enough information here for me to make an entirely different video, just think about how many more great teams you're familiar with who will be relegated to random reminiscing Twitter posts every summer. OKC could have gone back to the finals in 14 and 16, only to fall short at the hands of dynasty teams. Objectively, one of the most exciting teams I've ever watched will always be no more than a what if because of where they played. Harden had a couple great teams who either flat out couldn't beat Golden State or were sabotaged by injury. They're really the reason he's probably retiring ringless. The Clippers, also one of history's most exciting teams, will always be just that, an exciting team. Sure, the curse worked overtime, but they also lost fair and square at times when they should have gone all the way. As I said, I could do this forever. So in short, the West featured 3 dynasties since 2000, with multiple great teams buried behind them. Meanwhile, some of those great teams were fighting for their playoff lives when they'd have consistently been near the top of the East. And to make a very long story short, this, for one reason or another listed over the last hour plus, has been why the Eastern Conference has felt weak for probably a majority of your life.